Just one last thing to end with that. When Warhol, quite maybe a year and a half before his death, he was in an interview, and as Phillip suggested, he would often give these very pithy interviews where he would ask, well, is your work really about nothing? Yes. Is it really about something more important? Yes. In fact, we now sell in our gift shop a DVD that just has Warhol for an hour saying, yes, no, yes, no. And I think that was, as Phillip said, to really annoy people. But someone said, well, Warhol, Andy, what would you like to be remembered as? What would you want to be written on your tombstone? And he said, I don't like to think about death. I don't want to think about that. I just want to disappear. And we know, for example, he didn't attend his father's funeral when he was a young child. He ran up into the attic to not be part of it. When his mother died, about in 1970, he didn't go back to Pittsburgh to her funeral either. And then he said, I'd like to be reincarnated as a big diamond on Elizabeth Taylor's hand. I'd love that. So then the interview went on, and oddly enough, it was not the sort of thing that Andy would do. He came back and he said, well, you asked me that question about my tombstone. And he said, what I'd like to be on my tombstone is one word, figment. And figment is the word, at least in English, that means something that appears to be perhaps that never was there, or something that appears to be that is a projection of an image. So that the Andy Warhol, who walked around the streets of New York with the jacket like Phillip's, and the hair, which was not hair, it was a wig, carrying magazines of Interview, which he owned and he would give around, that was a figment. That was not Andrew Warhol, who went to Catholic Mass every day of his life, who was deeply generous and gave much money to charities, who on Christmas and New Year's, instead of going to parties at his family or his friends, would go to soup kitchens and give meals to the poor. Now, I don't say that now to sort of make him into a saint, not by any means. But those private things, who his lovers were, until recently we didn't even know who all those people were, all that was hidden, because that was Warhol felt that was what was him inside here. And what he created, this figment, this personality, like, as I said earlier, Eva Perón, was something that was for the public. That was what was sellable. And that's what would be remembered. But ultimately, it was just a figment.
Bueno, mientras, while we get the headphones for you too, so we can open the conversation, I want to ask you something. What does it mean to see Andy Warhol from Latin America when the concept of pop and the concept of the popular is so different, looking at it from the United States and looking at it from Latin America? What can you say about the context here? What does the context add to the exhibition?
I would answer that by saying I can't give a really strong answer because I'm not as aware of the equivalent pop elements of Latin America as I might be of Europe and the United States. I mean, one thinks of people dancing the tango in the streets of Argentina, and they do, but of course that is also, what do you call it, stereotypical. And I don't know all the mythical what do you call it? Or like the Mexican, what was the guy? There were hundreds of movies about him. Cantinflas was the actor. I can't remember his name. But that's a whole myth, but I don't know that as well as I would know Charlie Chaplin. Or some of the political myths of your past history. And so without that, but I mean, I was just saying, I once did an exhibition about 20-some years ago and included the work of a Colombian artist, Maria de la Paz Jaramillo. And I remember her work dealt with wonderful notions of people dancing and yet certain aspects of certain gangsters also in Colombian society. And that was very much like sort of a lot of pop imagery that you'd find, maybe not necessarily Warhol's, but some of those elements of the real, the imagined, the hypocritical, the marketable, all of those things together.
To be honest, the show was originally conceived for Cuba. The idea was that it was going to travel from Bogotá to Cuba at some point, and that it became impossible to do that because of the state of relations between the United States and Cuba. But I can say at least from that point of view that events like the Kennedy assassination look one way to an American and another way to a Cuban. And I think, you know, the political resonances of some of the more charged images has to be seen completely differently. I mean, in the show we have two works called, well, John Wayne and Geronimo, and these are sort of mythical figures of the American frontier. You have, you know, on the one hand, this sort of cowering Indian, and then you have John Wayne with the gun going to, you know, make the homeland safe for the Anglo-Saxon settler. And of course, you know, it's an idealized image with its romance and its movies and its entire code, but it's also a kind of, you know, it's almost like the violence of the founding myth that has to be, you know, it's a kind of master narrative that covers over the fact that the, you know, the American continent was settled basically by genocide. And so what you have, I'm not sure, I can't really, as Tom said, I'm not Latin American, I don't know how this would look necessarily down here, but I think that it's always interesting to present this work to a fresh audience. And with this specific theme, obviously, it may seem trite in a way to present Warhol's work in a political context of Latin America, because so much of what the press coverage in the United States, at least, about Latin America is dominated by politics. You know, it's Chavez, it's this, it's that. So, but I think there's a really interesting relationship between the United States, which sees itself as the regional power, and the countries of Latin America and Canada, where I'm from. And it's, you know, the competing spheres of influence, the ways in which America has shaped shaped these countries or failed to shape them, has failed to control them. And it's, again, it's a dialectic that, I mean, Warhol himself was he was no political theorist, but in a lot of ways, his work embodies all of these ideas. So it'll be interesting to see what the reception to the show is.
Vamos a tomar preguntas.
Las películas de las cuales no han hablado y que creo que hacen parte de una u otra manera de esta muestra, me gustaría que el director hablase un poco sobre estas películas, que es una parte importantísima de la obra de Warhol y que hace, quisiera que hablara, qué elemento hay entre la parte bidimensional que vamos a ver a la muestra con esta parte cinematográfica que es bien diferente a esta parte estética que él manejaba y que vamos a ver en esta exposición.
It's a very good question, because the films to me are just as important as the paintings. I see I see in some ways the early films are really like paintings by other means. He's using film, and these were projected in informal context. They weren't intended to be, I don't think they were conceived as films that would be screened in a cinematheque, and so they were part of a larger project that Warhol was achieving. But definitely, all of the films, in a lot of ways, are very pure distillations of the same set of concerns. It's, as Tom said, it's abstraction and figuration. If you look at a film like Sleep or Blowjob, which is in the show, it has an incredible abstract formal beauty, and yet at the same time, it's the formal device of slowing it down, of shooting a film at 24 frames per second, but projecting it at 16 frames per second, gives it an intense materialist quality, so that all the physical aspects of the film become foregrounded. It's, I think his films have been, there are a couple of reasons why the films haven't received have received inadequate publicity. One of them, obviously, is because they're not collectible items. It's easy, there's a huge market for Marilyns, there's a huge market for Jackies, and yet the films are not ever going to have that kind of thing, and so they just are not, the art world being what it is, there aren't as many incentives to put together, film concourses. So people are, I think in general, that's an aspect of his film that is not, or of his work that's not very well known. But I also think because the films are, in a sense, they can appear at first very daunting, difficult, and even at times boring, intentionally boring, I think. And for a lot of people, it seems that it seems more like an interesting annex to his work than a major part of it. I disagree with this. I think the films really, for me, in some ways, some of his films are among my favorite things by him. And in them, you see a lot of he's exploring the narcissism and the alienation of the '60s generation. You see a kind of reduction of cinema to its purest and simplest formal means, which is calling into question the most fundamental premises of the cinema. You have his strategy of non-interference, or the use of non-professional actors, predates Pasolini and Fassbinder by many years. He's, in so many ways, a crucial figure in the history of film. And yet, I think because of his other activities, and particularly those that won him kind of a bad reputation at some point, of being a portraitist, a courtier to wealthy people, or being a kind of an entertaining fool at parties, this aspect of it has been a bit obscured. But there's no question in my mind that some of the films, including Blowjob or Empire or My Hustler, are extremely, or for example, Vinyl, which is looking very true in these, in these times, have a tremendous subversive potential.